doing this thing behind the back and scratching and cutting, right? And then I saw Sun Ra do the same thing almost 40 years, 30 years later. I was like, wait, we're on this interesting wavelength that we need to have conversations about. Also, the physicality of Black musicianship, right? So what we're talking about then is Sun Ra, right? Sort of participating in creating an ideological world around the future in the 1960s. And then this video with DJ Scratch doing some similar movement, coming back almost 30 years later, ends up being sort of like a conversation that Sun Ra is having about the future, right? So that's an important thing. Also, I am always going to bring women into the conversation. We do not think about women as DJs enough. We do not think about women as musicians enough, right? So part of what I'm doing there is showing the way that, first of all, not just half of the race, right, is engaged in cultural production, but that men and women have been historically involved with creating the arts, right? But then this dualism, right? 2 turntables, 2 pianos, right? And then to take it to the next level and do some cutting and scratching with your breast is the future, right? Like that is somebody's future, right? Yes. So I just wanted to have you all see that link between sort of like the musicianship that comes along with DJ culture, but that there's a different kind of technology built around DJ culture, right? But the actual keyboard that Sun Ra was using was an electronic keyboard, right? And that he was also experimenting with technology. So in this conversation around Afrofuturism, we're going to get into this kind of interesting historic divide between like sort of Black people and technology, right? And so what Afrofuturism is doing in a way is kind of pushing back on that. And that is the sort of Afrofuturism that's read through a certain kind of understanding of technology. There are other forms of technology that are not necessarily electronic, right? There are technologies of white supremacy. There are technologies of resistance that extend beyond, right, sort of electronic equipment. So I use even the word technologies broadly to kind of talk about a practice and certain tools that you use to achieve a goal. Y'all with me?
Yes. Yeah.
So I want to get into the first sort of cultural practice that brought me to the game, to the DJ culture as a whole. So I grew up, again, like I said, Los Angeles, California. LA is known for having one of the first all hip hop stations. Anybody know what it is? Yeah. 1580 what? K-Day. K-D-A-Y, right? So in the 1980s, I was listening to a whole lot of K-D-A-Y. When I say a whole lot, I would grab a pen and a pad. I would push play and pause. I would record my favorite shows. I would, note the favorite DJs, some of whom included Dr. Dre, right? That's how I learned about Dr. Dre, because he was a DJ in KDAY. And so they were doing these interesting things, mixing, cutting, scratching. We're talking about early 80s. And so using turntables and a mixer was sort of a new practice. Obviously, we had taken hints from New York and what people were doing, mainly Caribbean folks who had migrated to New York and bringing the sound system to New York and sort of interrupting project life with this kind of pleasure and joy. And so I talk about the 1970s and being born there for a specific reason, because at the time that I was listening to KDAY, I was also witnessing what crack cocaine was doing to my community. I was also witnessing what Reaganomics was doing to social programs. I was also witnessing the complete shaming and silencing of people who had HIV or AIDS, right? So now we're talking about the disappearance of a number of bodies leaving our communities in the 1980s at the time that hip hop is on the rise, right? So these two stories are in conversation. So I would be listening to music, and then sometimes I'd hear my dad or my mom in the next room playing something. I'm like, what you over there playing Public Enemy for? They're like, no, that's James Brown, boo. I'm like, no, that's Public Enemy, right? So that's one of the first conversations I had about learning about the continuation of Black music through hip hop, right? So I started to think about hip hop as a living archive, as a repository. What I mean by does anyone know what I mean? First of all, I'm a teacher, so my instinct is going to be to ask questions. So do you all know what I mean by repository? Okay, good. Literally, right? Just think of the word deposit, positing, right? That you are depositing, that's what a sample is, right? That you are actually depositing or using hip hop as a place to store samples. What is it? So we know the samples are sort of pieces of music, sounds, right? Voices. So many DJs who are now producers, started sampling a lot of their parents' collection, right? So, like I said, listening to Public Enemy and then learning that DJ Terminator X, who was the DJ for Public Enemy, was actually digging through the crates and finding music that he could then sample and loop, and then helping Public Enemy to create this sound that was actually rooted in James Brown, right? So that chasing samples is very important. And you all understand what I mean by repository is like hip hop becomes a space where all these samples, right, are used to sort of connect generations to generations, but not just Black music, right? So through hip hop sampling and chasing these samples, I learned about Jimi Hendrix, Carlos Santana, Led Zeppelin, Sabbath, classical music, right? So chasing samples was a very important way for me to learn about different genres of music. And this is one thing that I feel like is written out of the story of what hip hop is. Part of what makes it futuristic is that it was grabbing so much of the history, right? And putting it into this current context and forcing us to have a different kind of relationship with time. Like, what is time? What is the past? What is the future? Is what the sample in that time and space, right? So check this out. Nice. right? Uh-oh, the original. Right? Right? So Lynn Collins, right? So meanwhile, if my grandma's playing Lynn Collins, I'm like, Mama, in there playing DJ Robbins. No, baby, I'm playing Lynn Collins. Right? And in fact, Lynn Collins, this song was important to us 10 years before you were born. Before you were born. Right? So again, the DJs who or the producers who created that song was digging through these time crates of history. But it doesn't stop there. When I talk about chasing samples and moving between the past and the future, when I think about Lynn Collins, for example, Lynn Collins came out of the James Brown Review, right? Then when I think about the James Brown Review, then I think about Bootsy Collins, who was no relationship. It didn't, wasn't related to Lynn Collins, but was actually the basis for James Brown. And when you think about the basis for James Brown and you think about P-Funk, then maybe you Queen Latifah, Lauryn Hill, the 1967 Newark riots, Amiri Baraka, right? That there are these different kind of samples that we're chasing, not just through music, but through history, right? That if you actually sit for a second in the history, chase the sample and end up, leaving Rob Bass, going to Lynn Collins, traveling to James Brown, going to Philadelphia, going to New Jersey, and learning the histories there. So then I begin to sample all of these stories, right? And put together my own sort of composition of understanding. And all of that comes out of DJ culture. Y'all with me? Yeah. So the second cultural practice is the DJ as an archivist, digging through the crates and building the collection. So yeah, we look for music at flea markets, in our grandparents' basement, in non-conventional spaces, so that we can find rare jewels to present to the community that trust us, right? To shape their understanding of the past and the future. And so digging through the crates is sort of a foundational practice that allowed me to further develop my research skills, right? So I didn't even know I was developing as a researcher, as a social scientist, simply by chasing these samples and then digging through the crates and building my collection and becoming well-versed on what I was listening to, and not listening passively or not listening as a pedestrian, but listening as an active participant, right? In conversations that are happening across timelines and across borders, right? So what you're looking at now is me actually digging through the crates, but surprisingly, I'm in the Netherlands. Wow. I went to the Netherlands because I was chasing the samples of Nina Simone's life. Nina Simone spent at least 2 decades in the south of France. That's where she died. But before that, she lived in Switzerland. And then after that, she moved to Amsterdam. And from Amsterdam, she moved to a place called Nijmegen. And that's actually where she ended up settling for a minute before she finally sort of found her resting place in the south of France. I've been to all the places where Nina Simone lives. And so one of the things that I want to talk about is the fact that, there are parts of an artist's life that we don't fully explore. And sometimes we leave the story in the United States, right? But she has this incredible story. She spoke French fluently, right? She was a swimmer, and part of her therapy, because for those of you who paid attention to the life of Nina Simone, she was at one point in her life diagnosed as being bipolar, which I happen to feel that it is a socially induced condition. Mm-hmm. So when she talks about how often she was exploited financially, when she talks about how her husband was abusive, when she talks about how her music was stolen by corporations, right? How does that impact the mind and the ability to function? Not to mention what it means to be a dark-skinned Black woman, right? So all of those things inspire me to ask deeper questions about her life. And I was sort of inspired to do that through my practice of digging through the crates. What does it mean to dig through the crates of Nina Simone's life outside of the context of America, right? And this is where it took me. And for you all who are like in school and thinking about different ways to generate resources, this is something that I wrote a grant for, right? And I use DJ culture as the foundation to ask folks for money. So when I'm asking for money to fund these practices and these global adventures, I'm actually thinking about reparations, to be honest. But the question is, do I have the language to articulate the value of my work, right? So again, we're moving between time and space. We're moving between time and space through DJ culture. And we are sort of complicating the notion of the future, right? So I'm going to keep asking you all with me. Yes. Let's get into the third practice. Album cover art, right? Visual history and visual literacy. So when we talk about Prince and he's talking about albums still matter, what is very important here to me is that album covers, right, created a certain kind of visual history of Black music and Black people, right? But also those album covers complicated what we were learning about, what we were learning about ourselves through popular culture. So we know those stereotypes, those super cynical, insidious stereotypes that rule our lives through Hollywood, speaking of LA, right? Album covers made it possible for me to have a different kind of relationship with the visual representation of Black people, right? That's very important because those albums then helped me sort of shape my own self-esteem around who I am and had me think more critically about the politics of representation, had me think more critically about self-determination, right? And had me think more critically about European standards of beauty, right? So I studied those album covers. My mom wrote her name on her albums, right? I had some Smurf tape in the 1980s. I put that across my album to let myself know, hey, this is mine, right? That Black people had a very particular kind of relationship with the albums. How many of you know people in your families that still have albums for over 20 years ago? Right? Albums end up being parts of the archives of our family histories, right? So I'm building my own personal archive, the archives that you all have through your parents, through your families. Those are all important records of existence.
Does it bother you then, streaming like a big thing now?
Streaming is the future, I guess, huh? So the tension between the past and the future. I am extremely convenienced by streaming, but also annoyed. Like both hands, right? Because if I want to go somewhere, one of the first places that I gigged was in London, in the 1990s. And I went there as a DJ to spin. And I can't even explain the pain in my arms for having to carry vinyl. That also limits my set, right? I could only take with me to another country, right? Now you're talking about DJs access to thousands and thousands and thousands of songs, which is a gift and a curse, right? Because I don't know how many of you have been in a dance floor where a DJ is going through a song a minute, Like soon before you get to your part, this cat has moved on. You were like, oh, okay. So I thought my jam, I thought the chorus was going to be a part of my dance floor experience, but this cat has moved on to the next 6 songs and the next 5 minutes, right? DJs don't even know what to do with the amount of access that we have, and it also is changing our, to bring that back full circle, changing our relationship to the album.
It's weird to get like the whole song.
See, now that's the sad shade. And you know what? It's a question too around our this kind of what I feel like is not only a war on intellectual curiosity, but a war on concentration. Right? Okay, let me hear the church say amen. I didn't know the church was so, but yeah, you know, so it's a real war on intellectual curiosity and concentration. So it actually takes a certain kind of, listen to this word, discipline, to have the kind of relationship that I want and that Prince encouraged us to have with the album, because the album matters just as much as Black life and books, right? So what this sort of relationship meant to me in terms of studying the visual history of Black music and Black people, and also globally, and also Latino folks, right? Indigenous folks, like again, my collection is not just of Black people. One of my favorite artists of all time is Bjork and Santana, right? And Jose Feliciano, right? Like, so but through Black music, I learned about the humanity of other musicians, the important cultural contributions of other people, of women, of trans folks, of queer folks, whoever it is, right? If you're bringing it and I'm feeling it, then it's going to be a part of the collection, right? So what the visual history allowed me to do is to be in a different kind of conversation with some of my favorite visual artists, right? So because I grew up studying the album, when I started going to museums, now going to a museum like Killmonger, like, what's that? Where's that from? What's that? Right? That was such a major moment in cinema. Just that's the question of the museum. But it ended up being a gateway to visual artists that to this day move me, right? So different artists, like, first of all, one of the first people that comes to my mind is actually Kara Walker, right? Kara Walker, Carrie Mae Weems. This is Kara Walker. So I'll let you all sit with that. Again, the relationship between albums and visual arts. This is Carrie Mae Weems. This is Carrie James Marshall, right? Basquiat, right? This allows me to have a different kind of relationship with folks like Frida Kahlo. This is Ernie Barnes. And if you, let me pause that right there. Does that look familiar? Right? Ernie Barnes, exactly. There's some people, y'all are one of my favorite folks. y'all are alive in here. That's major. Exactly. Ernie Barnes, who used to be a football player, right? But who did, this incredible sort of dance floor scene that ends up being JJ's masterpiece in the opening to Good Times. But because I know album covers, anyone else know where that is used? Marvin Gaye, I Want You. So this is right, but look at this, like, so right, so because I was already looking at Marvin Gaye, by the time JJ came on, I was like, Mama, look at, they're using Marvin Gaye's work on Good Times, right? And then I was like, oh, I know his style, I know his approach because of my relationship with albums, right? So that's Ernie Barnes, and again, more of his work. And I mentioned, I think I said Salvador Dali, and then Wengeche Mutu, right? And so, who's a Kenyan artist, Brooklyn-based. And so, moving on to the fourth and final sort of cultural practice that's a part of DJ scholarship are liner notes. And I call them music in the key of literary Black artists. As you all sit here and you have full access to a world-renowned writer, right? This is a major thing because what I've been trying to do is put the relationship between liner notes and Black literature in conversation, right? And so, liner notes ends up being, for me, a different kind of, or a non-traditional form of scholarship. So first of all, what are liner notes, you all? Raise your hands if you know. And if you don't feel no shame. Okay, very important that you don't know, because you're going to leave this room knowing, right? So liner notes are sort of the notes, the essays that helped us understand what the album was about, right? You can find them on the inside, on the outside of an album. You could find them on the sleeve that you pull out, right? So we have relationships. We're like, wait a minute, who is playing the bass on this Bob Marley song?
Right.
Or right, like oh, and then it's like, for example, I searched high and low for the liner notes for Dr. Dre. I wanted to know who was playing the live bass, and it's a guy named Colin Wood, who actually is a black punk guitarist.
Oh, wow.
Right? So just like those kind of stories. Who are the sound engineers? Are they women? Who are the women musicians behind some of these, right? Bands that we know the names of, like we may know the names of John Coltrane, right? But through liner notes, I learned that in 1967, his wife, who was not just simply his wife, but who was actually an incredible musician named Alice Coltrane, played the keys, right, on his 1967 album, right? So sometimes on the liner notes, you discover maybe some social context, right? So I stopped here because what happened was liner notes then pushed me into a different kind of conversation with Black writers. I was able to have a different kind of conversation with Black writers and think about the social context of music and think about sort of like the political reality of Black people through the imagination of writers, right? And I pull up Leroy Jones first, who later became, anyone know? Amiri Baraka, thank y'all. Amiri Baraka, feels good to have, again, thank y'all, right? Because a hardcore part of my job is call and response, right? So I'm not up here just like, ooh, like I want to know that y'all feel it, that you're listening, that you're present, so thank you. Leroy Jones becomes Amiri Baraka. So much of why I loved him is that he challenged the people who were doing two things, writing music reviews and writing liner notes. He challenged those people because they tended to be white men who would write without the social context, dehumanizing the artist when they are not invested in understanding why that music was important, right? Why A Love Supreme comes out in 1965, in the same year that Malcolm X loses his life, not loses, but is violently killed. What is the impact on John Coltrane? How can we sort of understand John Coltrane's recovery from heroin addiction? Where did heroin addiction come from? Why did it have such a serious role and prominence in Harlem or in Black communities across the nation, right? And so Amiri Baraka was like, how about let's do this? Not only am I going to begin to think through the history of Black music, I'm also going to take it upon myself to reach out to artists to ask them if they need me to write the liner notes. And many of them did. And then he also began to write music reviews, because I want to let you know a music review could determine, right, your ability to eat. There were so many white cis male musicians, music writers, who would write reviews that would destroy record sales, right? Because they're like, oh, this is abstract, we don't get it as far, it's improvisation, where's the composition, it's not structured, it's not European, essentially. It's not readable. In fact, it's highly cultural coded, right? Or culturally coded. And so Amiri Baraka would be decoding. This is what this means. This is why the horn comes in at this time. This is why it's important that we understand place, right? This is why it's important that we understand where Sun Ra is from. And the fact that Sun Ra is a Southern person, right? And then it makes you think, hold on, am I associating the South with the future? And the answer is usually no. Why? Because of what we learn about the South. The South is backwards. The South is not technologically inclined. The South is not thinking about the future. The South is not a part of the future. But now Sun Ra is one of the most cited futuristic artists, straight out of Alabama. Right? Because most Black American music is from the South. Because the South, for a number of Black folks, of Black American people, is a motherland, is a country. Is a country, right? So who is writing the stories of those musicians and those artists from that country? Right? And that is not to say that white folks or non-Black people can't write. There are people who write beautifully about Black people who are not white. There are Black people who write beautifully about white music. That's not the point, right? We're talking about the care. We're talking about an ethics of care that needs to go into these people and an engagement with them as human beings and not workers, right? Not workers. So this sort of investigation of the liner notes just led me to a whole nother world of just reading books about music, right? Blues Legacy and Black Feminist. I'm not going to name all of them, but the music of Black Americans, by the way, books written by Black women, right? The James Brown Reader, what? Right? So Development Arrested, which is a hardcore history of the blues as a political movement. Anthem, written by someone here, Shauna Redman. Scenes of Subjection by Sadia Hartman. The music, just the number of books that are written that are dedicated to understanding not just music, but a book like this, which is my favorite. It's about migration, right? Robin Kelly, another UCLA scholar who wrote the hell out of that book. Bell Hooks, who is a personal sort of inspiration to me, who taught me how to approach education critically, right? Critical pedagogy. I'm a serious student of Michael Jackson and Prince and Stevie. Yes. I also read magazines dedicated to music, and again, music and politics, and the politics of space and region, and interdisciplinary approaches to understanding music, right? Billie Holiday. Right, and so all of these books, Songs in the Key of Life by Mark Anthony Neal, who's an incredible music scholar. This is also his work. He's at Duke University. Incredible. I used this book in one of my class, also Mark Anthony Neal, right? Scenes of Subjection, talking about Black people and pleasure and what that looks like and what that looked like throughout time, what pleasure looks like for Black folks on the plantation. Yeah, plantation, pleasure. Again, two words that are not, right, that are almost seemingly disconnected. So this is what it looks like, right? This is DJ scholarship and practice. This is the full sort of theoretical framework that I'm using to understand, to investigate these interrelated histories, these interdependent histories. So I am collecting and assessing through the process of digging through the crates and sampling. I'm creating or I am engaged in a scholarly analysis, studying album cover art, and liner notes, right? A Black feminist blues epistemology, looking at sort of different modes and creation of knowledge through the lens of a Black feminist, right? And so that actually was inspired by a book that I read called No Mercy Here. Actually, Sarah Haley is here too. Yeah. Wow. Y'all, UCLA.
When you coming?
Uh-oh. I would totally be here. But like I'm just now putting together. You all have Tananarive, you have Shauna Redman, you have Robin Kelly, you have Sarah Haley. I mean, and get it. So Black feminist blues epistemology. That is something that I'm currently working on a book. Say, for example, about Willie Mae Big Mama Thornton. Mm-hmm. And she is the woman who, and I hate to simply introduce her as this because she is so much more, but she is the person who originally sang Hound Dog before Elvis, right? Elvis studied the Black church, Black rhythm and blues, Black music, and sort of changed the context of the song, blew up. His family is still generating income. She died in Los Angeles, California in a boarding house alone, much like Zora Neale Hurston, right? Much like so many of our artists, and particularly women, who, right? Because we talk about gender, gender pay gaps, gender equity gaps. Like, it's an important thing to think about, even as it relates to women in the music industry, right? So also the way, for example, that I look at and read Whitney Houston's life, right? That I never laughed when I saw the way that she was presented, when I saw that her life had become a spectacle without the proper investigation, again, of socially induced addiction and depression, and eventually death, right? And then just also knowing the history of how many Black women died, alone and addicted to drugs, from Billie Holiday, right, to Bessie Smith, to Ma Rainey, I mean, just to right, Memphis Minnie, to Nina Simone, right? Just that there's a myth of crazy around Black women that I am doing the work through a Black feminist blues epistemology to debunk, right? So Black music is social explanation, right? That we don't have the luxury, quite honestly, to constantly present music that is not relevant to understanding our lives. It happens, and it's also fine when it does. There is so much music available that explains the life, the political sort of worlds of Black people that folks can create for pleasure. I'm not policing that, but I'm very interested in the way that we talk about. How am I doing on time?
Oh, great.
Oh. Okay, but we need to get to the future too, right? So Black music is explanation, regional and interdisciplinary scholarship, Los Angeles, right? And kind of thinking about Los Angeles before Rick Ross, not the rapper, or thinking about thinking about Watts in 1965, thinking about the rebellion in 1992, thinking about not just Rodney King, but Latasha Harlins. Once again, there's another scholar here who was actually the chair department of the African Studies department here, who wrote a book on the life of Latasha Harlins.
Dr. Stevenson?
Yes, Brenda Stevenson. Absolutely. Yes. Right. So, also I'm a serious student of, shout out to you, Carlos, Detroit. Serious student of Detroit because I understand that techno is black music. And because also I'm a student of Berry Gordy, but also Alice Coltrane, who's from Detroit, Dorothy Ashby, who's from Detroit, George Clinton, who was not from Detroit, but who went there and helped, right, write songs with Motown. And thinking about all the people that came through Detroit, Michael Jackson, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Aretha Franklin. I mean, wow, right? So Detroit is absolutely a hot spot for understanding music. You Yusef Lateef, I mean, across the board. And thinking about Chicago, house music, also another form of black music. Thinking about go-go in DC, right? And sort of even the dances that come with, like, thinking about jitting in Detroit, thinking about crunk dancing in LA, right? Thinking about folks percolating in Chicago, right? That I'm interested in what black people are doing from place to place, right? So say, for example, when someone says, oh, that's hella tight. Where am I thinking? I'm thinking the Bay, right? I'm thinking the Bay. When I hear someone say, what up, though?
No, New York.
Detroit. I know, right? But places, right? So narrative shifts and historical revisioning, witness, testimony. I'm a serious student of James Baldwin. He is one of my spirit animals, I believe. I believe that he was born for me. And he holds me accountable, right? That it's one thing to be a witness. Sometimes a witness can be passive, but he told me to testify, right? With my work, whatever that means, witnessing and testifying. And then erase your resistance. I refuse to continue to ignore the contributions of queer people, of women, right? Say, for example, I will not engage another piece of art that uses Big Frida's voice, but not her face, or not their face, rather. Because Big Frida hasn't identified as trans, but Big Frida is someone who absolutely challenges gender binaries, right? And this is the second time that their voice has appeared, right, at the beginning of the song with no representation. At a time when trans folks, and not to say that they are that, but definitely they are an ally for trans folks. And when you think about the number of folks being violently murdered that are unaccounted for, we don't have time to erase the faces, right? And to use the voices as a way to push the product, right? So I am moving against erasure resistance. And so that's where I'm going with DJ scholarship. Are y'all with me? Y'all understand it?
Yes.
You understand where I am with it? Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to move into, first of all, are there any questions? That's a lot of information. Let me let y'all take a pause before we shift gears.
Sidebar, where do you teach?
Cal State LA is my home school.
Okay.
Yep.
Go to the guy that lives in Lewis?
Uh-huh. Yes. Yep. Pan-African Studies Department. Yep. And the Chicano Studies Department.
This is perhaps a very loaded question.
Maybe.
But
I love a loaded question. Maybe.
in the sense that you referenced a lot of different authors who inspire you. And on my trajectory, I have a lot to go in terms of my own research.
Yeah.
But I'm coming across a lot of different people who speak to me in a personal way.
Yeah.
And so my question is, with your experience and scholarship, how do you find your own narrative within those other scholars and not be overwhelmed by so much of material? Because I'm sure you have so much more you want to say, but you have to stick to your themes and your question.
Oh, it's a piece of work. That's an important question as we navigate, negotiate our time in these academies, and the insistence on referencing, right? But because I come from a history of chasing samples, that comes naturally to me, right? So say, for example, Kanye is masterful at sampling, right? But I'm gonna tell you one thing, he creates a different song. It's that. It's exactly that, right? So I want to continue to use these cultural producers as real references. We can actually move away from Foucault for a second.
Yes.
And we could actually engage Kanye as a critical thinker, regardless of whatever sensations and spectacle, whatever, right? Is that he is undeniably committed to a level of cultural production that is worthy of review, and in fact worthy of scholarly review, right? So, but through the art of sampling, I have learned how to reference and maintain my own voice? That's actually a really incredible question. And when I move away from that, because I actually am in a graduate program right now, working on a second graduate degree. When I move away, thank you. When I'm we'll talk about that. When I move away from that, I can feel it becomes a question of integrity. Like, wait a minute, it's actually not what I would say. And I trust what I say enough, right, to insert my voice here. And I know how to also reference. I'm not out in the streets plagiarizing, right? But I can actually trust that I am creating something that is theoretical. And I can do that without pulling from a lot of dead white men to validate my thoughts. Truly. And I'm reading a lot of those dead white men. I'm not like, hey, right? No. I need to know what I'm not doing. That's actually huge, right? That's a great question. That's not at all we're charged.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
How do you balance your art? Yeah.
No, go ahead. How do I balance my?
How do you maintain yourself as an artist and as an activist, especially I'm assuming like learning to be hands-on with people, you know what I mean? Like musicking and saying how your art like empowers people. How do you balance being able to do that as an event while also getting multiple graduate degrees and the amount of like laboratories and like kind of like sometimes like robotic labor that's necessary to get research done in scholarships, especially at like a high level. So I'm just curious.
That's a great question. I committed first and foremost to study what I love, right? So that is not as laborious as it seems, right? Because it is it is rooted in passion. And that's a bit of a luxury. There's so many families that are coming from a context where parents are like, no, let me tell you what you're not going to do. You're not going to enter the arts. You're not going to I'm actually getting an MFA. You're not going to be an artist. That is not where the money is, right? So then it becomes an interesting sort of subversive act to say, actually, to me, like, music is the thing that comes most naturally to me, right? So then how can I build the infrastructure around my practice? And that's what I said. So it did take years of being engaged in a critical reading process and really, really developing a different kind of relationship with English in particular, so that I could ask for money in a way that would be undeniable. Like, I need you to do the work to prove to me like why this application is being rejected, right? Because I've hit all of it, and that isn't to say, listen, and I get rejected. I have rejection letters, just like Toni Morrison frames her rejection letters, right? I keep mine among like, I remember y'all rejected me now. Like, you also have someone in this classroom with you who is well versed in generating, sorry to put you on the spot, thousands of dollars, right? For his practice. His name is Carlos. You all should talk to him. He's a part of an incredible arts collective in Detroit. And Carlos, raise your hand. Right?
Sorry.
You all should. I mean, really, because there are a lot of artists. There are a lot of artists, and I'm going to tell you all, take advantage of UCLA, the grant money. I just got a grant from the UC school that I'm at to go to the south of France for the summer to read Baldwin, right? Because he lived there, and I was able to say, this is an important thing for me to do. This is how it relates to my work. This is why it matters. Give me a few thousand, right? So take advantage of those resources to help you create the balance and the time you need to do your work. And am I always able to do it? Absolutely not. There are moments where I'm like, okay, I need to work. And there are moments when I don't even want to read what I'm passionate about, right? So let me just be very clear here. Like, there are moments where I'm like, am I sitting my ass up here scrolling on Instagram and not doing my work? Am I reading the latest Black Twitter, clapback? Like, what am I doing? Because I happen to believe that we're in a very, like I said, the war on curiosity to me looks like the social media addiction that I feel like a lot of us are struggling with. To me, it feels like a public health issue, addiction, right? That like, I'm like, if you ask people, I actually, interestingly enough, I posed this question on Twitter. How many of you are able to read for extended periods of time? Many people, that thing got tweeted, Jack. Like, people were like, not me. Right? Right? Like, you too. Right. You're like, you too, right? So it takes a certain kind of protection of the psychic space. Because we are, do you want to talk about the future? Because there are different ways to think about futurism. Yes, there's Afrofuturism, but again, speaking of Detroit and the techno movement that developed out of this idea of, yes, our sort of understanding of the future and spaceships, yes, that, but there's a book called Future Shot that a lot of the Detroit producers were reading, three in particular, right? Jesse Saunders, Juan Atkins, right? Derek May, that they were reading and trying to understand the pace at which we were being, right, propelled forward. We know what the hashtag now means, that something has a very, very limited shelf life, even if it's life itself, even if it's the hashtag of someone who was taken from us. We move on to the next hashtag. What does that do for our abilities to sort of concentrate on the word? And also, what does it mean that we are consuming so much trauma at this accelerated pace? These are real questions to deal with how the future has been sold to us, right? And now we're addicted to access and to instant gratification, right? So that balancing has to include a real conversation around the amount of time we spend on social media, right? I really respect people who can really disengage. Do you know how many times I've seen people post, "I'm done, I'm finished, this is taking up too much time." Next day, did y'all see the cute little cats in the? It's like, right, that kind of addiction. It's visible. It's embarrassing because you just said you're not able to accomplish it, right? Like now here you are posting kitty cats chasing M&Ms, right? So I really want to just remind us as students of life. I am a student for the rest of my life to be super protective of our psychic space. So 1:30, okay, 15 minutes. So interestingly enough, again, another student. So Professor do you what do you guys what do you
Professor Do.
Okay, so Professor Do is gangster for so many reasons, right? I remember having a partner who was, and that's actually not Adrian, who was actually reading her book, one of her books, it's a trilogy.
Like The Living Blood and My Soul to Keep.
My Soul to Keep. I'm talking about reading it and being scared. Like that's an incredible impact to have on your readers. Where you're scared reading a book? I mean, right? Like, so I'm just thinking about the fact that part of how we met in the first place is because when she was at Spelman doing an incredible job as a visiting scholar, she created the first. Was it the first? Yeah, it's the first. Stop it, Capricorn. So the first Octavia Butler conference, and I'm talking about pulled together some of the most important voices: Samuel Delaney, Nalo Hopkinson, Adrienne Marie Brown, Juno Diaz, Dream Hampton, and also brought in other folks, artists, visual artists, brought in me as a DJ to talk about futurism and in particular Detroit techno and Chicago house music, and thinking about electronic music as a projection of the future for people, right? No, I'm telling you all are sitting in a classroom with gold, right? Like this is a true literary activist. And I say that because Octavia Butler, Kindred, my God. I mean, I know that you all just read Dawn, right? I would advise you to just, if you haven't already, to keep going through that, right, through her bibliography. I mean, I'd like to call it a discography, but but Kindred in particular, what it told me, along with this very important book, what it told me, those two books in conversation, is that the future is actually a project rooted in history, right? You cannot be Octavia Butler and Toni Morrison and create speculative fiction and horror and fantasy and not understand history. Their work is historically accurate. They are researchers, right? That there is a certain kind of literary scholarship. They're not just out in these streets, meeting a word count goal, but that they are actually researching. The amount of time that Toni Morrison and Octavia Butler spent in libraries, the amount of time that James Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry spent in libraries, right? So that they could kind of create this spectacular work that stands even as their bodies are not here, save for Toni Morrison, who's still with us, right? So thinking about Black people's relationship with history, actually also as a way to correct the incredible white supremacist ideological myths and legends that sometimes govern the way that we view ourselves, right? So, say for example, one thing that we don't think about is I talked about this pleasure on the plantation, right? Like, and I'm saying we are making an assumption. I'm generalizing, obviously. When I read that idea of pleasure and plantation, it made me realize how distant I have been from the idea that these people who were enslaved, because they were not slaves, right? That these people who were enslaved also had sexual desire, also laughed, right? And although the conditions under which that desire existed is absolutely questionable, not even questionable, is violently was violently disruptive, pleasure persisted. And I like to call this kind of pleasure a form of misery resistance, right? This is a misery resistance. You cannot, we're talking about a question of dignity. There is nothing that you can do, in fact. I can still reach for my dignity. And so that is something that both those writers are doing in these books, right? Kindred and Beloved. There's an interesting kind of reaching for dignity, even if it's in changing or correcting the record or inserting or interrupting, right, the legend, because we don't think about the different ways that Black women fought back on the plantations, right? And so, what does it mean? Toni Morrison forced us. She went into history. She was reading a newspaper and saw a story about this woman, Margaret, I can't remember her last name, and saw that this woman was had killed her children in the face of I'm telling you the book, but listen, just she questions motherhood, but also say, for example, our gendered understanding of slavery, right? We think of men hanging from trees, women being raped. We don't think of pregnant women hanging from trees and men being raped. We don't think, right? It's just a very, in our mind, we have been convinced to not think about the holistic way, the project of slavery that terrorized every part of us in the same way that we continue to talk about Black men dying from the police, as though women are not.
Exactly.
Right? Or as though a juvenile justice system doesn't exist with so many Black children inside of it, right? That we just talk about violence and police violence as being a super, right, cis male experience, right? So that extends back to how we have learned about our experiences as people, right? With this project, this long-standing, multi-century long project called white supremacy, right? So then we're talking about, again, this tension between history and the future, right? So Toni Morrison and Octavia Butler reach back into the history and use historically accurate accounts, whether they're from slave narratives or newspaper clippings, to project an entirely different story onto the future, right? That's Afrofuturism to me, right? Is the use of history as a tool to correct history, even as you are sort of having to imagine a different kind of possibility that is not necessarily always rooted in trauma, right? So this is something that moves me too, you know, like looking at this image, I could place it, I mean, anywhere from 17th century, 18th century. When I look at this, I also see a dance floor. You know, I see surrendering. Look at these hands. There's a surrendering, right? And this is something that I also like to call futuristic faith. What does it mean to wake up enslaved? Where your music is then shaped by the constant reach for tomorrow. The constant reach for tomorrow, right? So then the quote unquote old Negro spiritual is what Du Bois would call the songs of sorrow, actually are rooted in futuristic projections of freedom in the future, right? Like the sort of futuristic or future oriented music that is in constant conversation with a life beyond today, right? So in so many forms of music, not just the obvious sort of Outcast that's out now, or Outcast is not out now, but some of the stuff that Andre was doing with the future, even some of the stuff that Missy does with the future, obviously Janelle Monáe becomes a reference. I'm arguing that you can find futuristic projections in every form of Black music from this time forward. That's what my argument is. So if we take a look at the blues, right, then we may discover these lyrics that are linked to what some of these folks were talking about, right? Then we even think about the kind of interesting mystical role of the preacher, the minister, who again is not always a male and who sometimes looks like a DJ. Meaning we could put some turntables in front of this person here and we have a party, right? So we kind of want to think about the role of the sort of charismatic figure that is leading the dance floor and or the congregation and or the juke joint, right? So I'm a hardcore student of the Black church, because I understand it to be the first cultural institution, right? And I'm very aware of the respectability politics that came out of the Black church that contributed to some of the silence and shaming around AIDS in the 80s, right? Because I'm connecting that to a colonial experience. I'm connecting Christianity to a colonial experience. But the Black church is future oriented. One day soon, right? Salvation, next level, other realms, next time, coming back, going into, grabbing for, right? Ascension, right? This constant reaching. Then I started to notice, wait a minute, you listen to house music, you are constantly hearing references to ascension and to the sky and to leaving this place and to getting to the next level and getting to the next time and getting to the next place, right? So even in the 1980s and 1990s, folks are having a conversation with the Black church for many reasons. First of all, because so many people were migrating to these places like Chicago and Detroit, right? And taking their cultural products with them. So I'm, again, arguing that this futuristic faith is rooted in the Black church and that it actually surfaces in multiple forms of Black music. Y'all with me?
Yes.
So let's hear a little something.
Still away. I ain't got long to stay here. This song which was composed in slavery when the Black folks picked and chopped cotton in the hills of Georgia, Tennessee, and this song for they're still away, for they pray to their heavenly Father to free them from on a bondage. So this is a song that they sung. I hope y'all will enjoy it too, because it means something to you. Still away.
So I'm going to stop it there because I want somebody to tell me what the heck it means to steal away. I mean, steal away? Right. When you are using these Christian hymns to talk about the possibility of a plan of escape, when you were talking about stealing away possibly yourself, right, so that you can get to that future where you could be engaged as a human being, right, then you have to do the work to go back into the old Negro spirituals and look at how coded, right, the gospel songs are, not gospel, but the old Negro spirituals are. Right, the cats are talking about still away, which could easily mean meet me by the magnolia tree near the North Star. We're going through Detroit to get to Canada. We're going to land in Halifax, right, which is a place where tons of Black Americans escaped to, crossing that super cold Detroit River, right, that we have, Black Americans have these ancestors in Canada that are then directly linked to this music. So literally we have a soundtrack for everything that's been happening over the last, hundreds of years. We have a soundtrack that we could use to understand what happened in our own voices, if you're committed to decoding, right? And not just being entertained. Then again, you have Carol Walker doing this really interesting commentary on, let's just say, white supremacy's first form of technology. 2 minutes. First form of technology, right? Black women's bodies to produce more workers. That's technology. What is it, right? So that's an interesting way to think about the future. Blues mythology, the crossroads, I'll end it here. Selling your soul to the devil at the crossroads is a way to secure supernatural skills as a musician. These are old blues legends, right? Directly related to voodoo and Papa Legba, right? So look at what an artist has done, right? One of these artists is like uses Robert Johnson to kind of project an interesting kind of take, right? On the blues and on the future and on history. That is both futuristic and rooted in the history, right? So thank you all so much for the energy that you've given and just for the attention and just for the time and just for your generosity. Thank you so much.
This is a completely different presentation than last time, but I'm taking notes along with them. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all for inviting
for
me.
gracing us with your knowledge. If you did not sign the attendance sheet, be sure to stop by this table on your way out. Everybody have a great afternoon. I'll see you here in our new room on Tuesday.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Did you guys set it up in the
We started,
other
but you
room?
got the email before we got it all set up.
So I was like,